Oretz, and they returned from scouting out the land, right? Miketz Arom Yom. After 40 days, they scouted out the total Canaan. So Rashi over here cites the Gemara. Lo arba meus parsa al arba meus parsa he. The size of Eretz Yisrael is 400 parsa by 400 parsa. That's 1,200 miles by 1,200 miles. An average person walks 10 parsos a day. So it takes 40 days just to go from east to west. But they scouted the land to its breadth and its width, so that they were able to cover the full extent, the topography of the land, every aspect of the land, was a miracle. Meaning, the Meraglim themselves realized that they were able to do it in half the time. So when they went to scout out the land, although they come back with these ominous reports, they realized that God performed the miracle for them, because it's impossible to scout out the land within 40 days. But yet, for some reason, that did not resonate with them. So why did God perform the miracle on their behalf? Especially they had this evil intent. Since ultimately the decree was going to be, every day they scouted out this land with this evil, negative intent, lack of faith, it would be decreed that they have to wander for an additional year in the desert. Therefore God performed a miracle that it would take half the time, because if it would have taken twice the time, they would have wandered for 80 years. So therefore, God had Rachmanus on Klal Yisrael, and therefore they scouted out the land 50% of the time. Okay? It's interesting. Just a simple question. The concept of punishment is what? Is atonement. So to the degree that one sins, the punishment fits the transgression. You need that much punishment to be rehabilitated, to be reinstated. So what was the sin? The sin was that they came back and they had slandered God, slandered the land with these ominous reports, and the Jews believed the 10 over the 2. And as it says, that night was the night of Tisha B'Av, and they bemoaned their fate, there was no basis for it, because if they would have believed Yeshua and Kalev, there was nothing to mourn and to grieve over. So God says, because you cried a crying which was baseless, the night of Tisha B'Av, in the future I will give you what to cry about. There'll be a basis for that crying. But factually, why 40 days? Why 40 years? Because they scouted out the land for 40 days. A year corresponds to the day. But if it would have taken them 80 days to scout out the land, twice as long, they would have had to wander for 80 years in the desert. And because God understood this, therefore he performed the miracle, they could do it in 50% of the time. I mean, if the sin is lack of faith and lack of trust, which is unconscionable, what difference does it make how many days it would take out to scout out the land? If it took 1 day, 40 days, or 80 days, that has to do with the Meraglim. The Meraglim despise themselves. They're the ones who failed. They failed. The Jews accepted the ominous reports as a result of lack of faith. What is the amount of time that it took to scout out the land? Why does that determine the degree of transgression? And therefore it needs a greater level of atonement. We're going to see in a moment, and next posuk, Vayelchu v'yavo'u el Moshe. It says they went and they came to Moshe. I mean, we're speaking now on the return. They're returning from their 40-day trek. scouting expedition, and they're coming back with these fruits they had cut to show that just as the fruit is of abnormal dimension, to be able to survive Canaan, you have to be of abnormal dimension. And the Torah says, Vayelchu vayavo. So the question is, say Vayavo el Moshe v'Aaron. They're returning. So Rashi over here cites Chazal, if you look. Ma'al vayelchu lahakish halichoson lebioson. To equate the going to the what? To the returning. Ma bioson ba'etzero. Just as they already went with its evil intent, with his negative eye. When they returned with that same intent, to slander the land, to slander God. So if you remember, we had asked, the Orach Chaim asks, we find that when God chose them, it says they were anoshim, they were devout, they were tzaddikim. So when they left, they were not what they were when they returned. And yet the Torah over here tells us that when they had left, they already were tainted with this negative approach, this perspective, to come back with not good reports, with ominous reports. So that means we see even when they left Yerushalayim, so the Orach Chaim HaKodesh had answered that they themselves initially were tzaddikim, but because based on the principle of shluch shlom kamoso, that an agent is in the stead of the one who commissions him. So because each prince represented his tribe, and Klal Yisrael themselves lacked in faith when they hooked into the system of each tribe, they were impacted negatively by the doubts of the tribes themselves. If they wouldn't have represented them, they would have been able to weather the storm easily. But once they attached themselves within a spiritual context of being a shliach, that the shliach is linked to the one who he represents, they were affected by the mindset, the purview of each of the tribes. So it comes out this way. Initially, they were tzaddikim. The moment they left, they already left as agents of their tribes. Once they were attached on that halachic context, they were affected. So what happens, every one of the days that they traveled, the 40 days, going with that jaundiced eye, due to being linked to the people, that 40-day trek was every day with that negative eye was due to the people. So the scouting, seeing it with that kind of eye, that's the sin. That is the basis to slander the land. As a result of that, the decree was 40 years, a year per day. If they would have gone with that jaundiced eye for 80 days, that means what was the basis to come back and slander God and to create the Schil Hashem? It was that eye was seeing 80 days rather than 40 days. And who has that level of liability? The tribes, because it's only due to the tribes' lack of faith. That lack of faith affected and impacted and diminished the original status of the spies themselves. Therefore, it would have been an 80-year punishment rather than 40. So Hashem says, you will only scatter the land 40 days. So the intent is only in place for half the time. So therefore, the punishment is half rather than twice as much. Therefore, we want it for 40 years rather than for 80 years. That's the way I understand it. Any comments?